Okay. So I'm Roland Harwood. I'm co-founder of 100% Open. We describe ourselves as a open innovation agency. And so what that means is we design and run kind of innovation programs and competitions, usually for large organizations, big multinational companies, big charities, big government organizations. And we're a facilitator of workshops, a builder of online communities, and I guess a sort of provocative, strategic kind of thinker or what have you. And we connect organizations, we help them figure out how they can work together, and then our job is to bring new products and services to market. So we work with people like Lego, who are just behind me, Procter & Gamble, a lot of work with various charities, Marie Curie, Oxfam, and some government agencies like Ordnance Survey and Technology Strategy Board. So yeah, that's us.
All right. I'm wondering, there's quite a few initiatives at the moment that talk about open innovation of various forms. And I'm just wondering if you could reflect on how, what it is that you're doing differently, or how you're defining open as compared to the sort of wider open innovation field.
Sure. Well, so yeah, we're called 100% Open. So we keep an eye on the use of the word open, I guess. So obviously open innovation, which is how we have positioned ourselves in the 3 years that we've been around. It builds on open source principles, I guess, and methodologies, but things like open data, open government are all kind of hot topics right now. I guess we, at its highest level, we're trying to design the open organization, help co-create an open kind of organization, I guess, with the web and globalization and other kind of trends. I think the days of the kind of closed, secretive organization are going, if not, they're not gone just yet, but that's the trend. And so things like open innovation tend to still be quite dominated by, I guess, technology, so technology development, and the sorts of people that work in that field are engineers or technologists, which I am, by the way, and that's not a criticism, but I think we try and take a wider look at culture and skills and mindsets, and as well as technology that sits within that. So at its highest level, we're trying to rewire organizations to be more networked and more open.
In some of the conversations that I've been just initiating so far along this way, we've had a lot of, I guess you would say, fear associated with becoming open, and from companies that are saying, you know, how can I be viable? How can I mean, and it's not a sort of automatic response. Yeah. And I was just wondering if you get that, and also where you think that's coming from.
So yeah, we get that all the time. That's kind of, you know, almost question number one, phrased in different ways. But I think where it's coming from is partly just it's new, it's different. We're taught, rightly or wrongly, that you know, the way organisations work is by creating value sort of internally. That's the model, the mechanistic model that has been deeply ingrained in our psyche and our economy. And it's I think open innovation is fundamentally about admitting we don't have all the answers, and that we want to look outside to find some answers outside. So that's to some extent showing vulnerability and uncertainty, and those are things that often, especially in professional life, we feel less comfortable doing because we want to be the experts, or we want to, you know, pretend rightly or wrongly that we know what we're talking about. So that it requires a kind of different sensibility and a different mindset as well. But I think once people have embraced it, and often people embrace it conceptually very quickly, but then practically it takes much longer. But once they've embraced it and tried it and had some early success and feedback, it's essentially a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And then, so I guess what I mean by that is if you kind of cynically think this is a load of rubbish, you almost certainly will undermine any attempts at openness to be successful. So you need to kind of buy into it as a principle, and then it's a leap of faith. You know, open up, and then you'll only see the value of doing so by actually doing it. So it does require some bravery. And you know, a new way of working. So yeah, lots more I could say about that.
Yeah, I'm interested to pick up on that in a sense, because one of my questions was about whether you could share some of your insights with us on the types of environments and behaviors that encourage open innovation from your perspective, and vice versa, of course.
Types of environments,
or how it also how an open organization would behave.
Well, I think if I can touch on the environment point first. So this stuff is all rapidly accelerated by the web and Web 2.0 and the internet. So sort of digital communities lend themselves to this, or anything that's digitizable really lends itself to this more quickly. So more product-based businesses are probably playing catch-up in this space, but they will get there too. But I mean, just to use Lego as an example, they kind of 10 years ago launched a product called Mindstorms, which was developed by a small team of 10 people, which is a standard way that most large organizations do product development. But within a few weeks, there were hundreds of thousands of people online talking about the product, which is great marketing, but more than that, they were actually they were innovating the product. They hacked into the code in these robots, and they were rewriting the code and making the robots do new stuff. And in short, they were innovating Lego's product, but they were actually infringing on Lego's copyright. So Lego thought about trying to shut this down because they couldn't control it, but to give them credit, they realized something interesting was happening. And this is all pre-Facebook and pre-Wikipedia, so some of these online phenomena were less familiar then as they are now. And anyway, to cut a long story short, it became Lego's most successful product of all time at the time. And so it forced them quite early to realize that, hang on, there's something interesting going on here, that if we can actually do this proactively rather than reactively, we can do some interesting stuff here. So, so the environments are usually fueled by some kind of digital online networks, but in my experience, our experience, it's always enhanced by people getting together at some point in the process in a room together and building trust and building relationships, which is, I still think you can't beat that kind of face-to-face kind of interaction. So a mixture of that. And your second part of that question, I've now forgotten what that was.
It was about behaviors, really,
okay.
Which I suppose is, you've touched on a bit with taking risks and et cetera, being less possessive. But I wondered if you had other, I mean, it's sort of an abstract way of asking about how organizations would behave were they wanting to become more open, what that kind of behavior entails.
Sure. I think one of the behaviours is just, as I said earlier, kind of admitting we don't have all the answers. So perhaps just saying that, which is a kind of, showing a little bit of vulnerability, but then showing a kind of interest and enthusiasm and engagement for what your customers might have to say, what your suppliers might have to say, and maybe just sharing kind of problems that you're currently faced with or working on, and seeing what comes back. So I think the behaviour, if I can summarise it very briefly, is sort of give get. So you want to give time, data, resources, skills, knowledge, and then the value kind of flows back from doing that. So it requires almost a kind of generosity of spirit, and almost the faster you can be generous, it's like sort of compound interest. It accrues. So it requires, I think, a different way of thinking, especially in business where we tend to still be all around maximising our value, quite a kind of selfish attitude. So I think it does require a mindset shift as well as kind of process and kind of cultural shift.
There's a couple of things that I'd like to follow up from that. You mentioned Lego as being a kind of an interesting and somewhat unusual example for having to pivot. I wondered if there's other individuals or organizations or projects that you think are applying open principles or protocols that are doing it particularly well that you would want to highlight to us.
Yeah. Okay, well, so the two other organizations that I would always talk about in this context, as well as Lego, are Procter & Gamble and Mozilla. So P&G embraced a sort of open innovation strategy and methodology 10 years ago, partly because, just very quickly, they have essentially a kind of human resources policy to only recruit at entry level in the business, so sort of graduate level or straight from school, and then they promote from within. So everybody understands the P&G way of doing things, and it's great for efficiency, but it's not so good for innovation, where perhaps you want some disagreement and diversity of opinions to spark new ideas, new thinking, creativity. So partly because they had such a homogenous culture, they set a strategy for 50% of their new product and service ideas to come from outside of the business, which at the time was very countercultural for them as a business, but also within their sector. And it took them a few years to get up and running, but now they have significantly outperformed all of their competitors. through this strategy, and they now have a very efficient way of hoovering up kind of problems in the business, making decisions about which ones they're going to solve internally versus which ones they're going to push out. And then they've built all kinds of networks with universities and customers and suppliers and other brands to partner with. And so, they've kind of systematized it and globalized it in quite their program is called Connect and Develop. And so they are a company that does this particularly well. And the other one, very quickly, Mozilla. So obviously producer of the Firefox browser, most popular browser in the world, I think. Could be wrong on that, but also lots of other products. They are incredibly open as an organization in a way that Lego and P&G, I think, are still relatively traditional in the way they structure themselves. So Mozilla have a small core team of people, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people within their network and ecosystem that work with them on the product. They webcast all of their board meetings. They delegate decisions about the future of the product and the future of the business to people that aren't on the payroll. That kind of radical openness requires bravery, and it requires protocol, and it requires systems, and it's not easy. But I think the success of Mozilla and the browser and the product and the organization is plain to see. And I don't think that will work for all organizations in all sectors, but that kind of ethos feels to me like it's the way the world is shifting.
So there seems to be a lot happening right now in the field of open business.
Mm-hmm.
I'm seeing, we're all seeing lots of unusual and independent things getting funded through crowd sourcing platforms.
Yeah.
We're seeing more peer-to-peer lending initiatives.
Yeah.
We're seeing moves towards greater transparency with like open corporates, and making all kinds of exchanges available online and traceable. And even like software backbones to help lower the barriers around like new banks gaining entry into the market, or buying a sort of software, shared software that you can plug into. And these are quite exciting things. And I just wondered, out of what you're seeing in the field, what you're personally most excited for in terms of advancing open business and what that means.
So I guess I'm a sort of data geek, and I like the whole kind of open data movement, which really interestingly I think is actually being led by kind of governments and public sector, which is really unusual. Almost always public sector is playing catch up with the private sector in most instances, but I think right now that is being reversed, and especially in the UK and US there's a real drive towards opening up government data, and it's a bit of a kind of Wild West at the moment. It's the frontier. It's a big risk. How will we create value? How will we protect privacy? And there's all kinds of issues at the moment around PRISM and all the rest of it, which probably haven't got time to go into. But I think there's. I remember reading once that something around there'll always be graffiti as long as it costs more to cover up graffiti than it does to actually scribble your name or your whatever on a wall. Then you'll always have graffiti because the costs of covering it up are greater than the cost of actually doing it. And I think the same goes for data, really. So these days it is easy to either proactively or inadvertently share data, a spreadsheet or an API or whatever. And so I think we're much better as a society and as organizations to share that proactively, assuming the default is open, and then respond to that, rather than try and maintain secrecy for the sake of it, and then inadvertently leak data and then have to deal with the repercussions. So I think, and if I may sort of posit a somewhat sort of grand theme, which is I think if we assume transparency and openness is the default, I think that forces us to be more responsible citizens as individuals, but also more responsible organizations, because we know, at least in theory, that anybody can check what we've been doing, how we've been spending our time, how we've been spending our money. And so that forces us to do that in a more responsible way, possibly than previously, where we thought, and I'm generalizing massively, but where kind of privacy was the default. So I have hope that will shift, a kind of societal shift into more kind of responsible business practice and more widely. But there are risks attached with that, of course, and the current media debates around the PRISM program, for instance, are really fascinating, and these things are definitely not all one-sidedly a good thing. There's a whole bunch of stuff we need to figure out. And Don Tapscott, the author of one of these books up here, Wikinomics, talks around the need for organizational openness but kind of personal privacy, and I think there's something to be said for that, because the individual perhaps can't protect their own rights in a way that an organization could. And so again, a whole debate around all of that stuff, but yeah.
So what are the risks? I'm just curious, like on the being a pessimist, on the pessimistic side, you know, you have aspirations for the potential of open data and big open data. What are some challenges that might be barriers to making that happen?
Well, in the short term, so a few years ago in the UK, when all the MPs' expenses receipts were leaked to the Telegraph newspaper, it was a huge backlash against kind of political classes, because I think quite rightly in almost all cases they were saying, why are we spending, you know, taxpayers' money on all kinds of things which, you know, people felt they shouldn't be spending it on, which I think has forced politicians to, in the UK at least, to be much more careful about how they spend taxpayers' money, which I think is a good thing and a responsible thing. But sorry, the question was around the risks of
not the risks related to open data, but more like that the kind of opportunities around it won't get taken up in a way. Well, yeah, I think the opportunities are endless. So I think we need to accept that this new open connected world is full of, you know, limitless possibilities, and so we will only ever scratch the surface of the potential of that. But I think we can tap into much more of the potential that's out there. We do a little exercise at events of kind of 50 or more people, where we invite somebody to shout out somebody they would really like to get to, talk to, and then ask other people in the room, does anybody know that individual, that organization, or know how to get to them? It always works. It's a kind of, we call it 2 degrees of separation. That connectivity is in any room of people, in any online community. It's a question of visualizing some of those connections, and then, you know, the potential of those connections is vast. But I think we therefore need to accept that we won't ever realize the value of all of those connections. But I think it's about becoming more open, sharing some of the challenges that we have, or the skills or the resources that we might have to offer, and so it's on an organizational level, it's becoming much more about a relationship-orientated approach to business rather than a sort of transactional approach to kind of partnership, which is still the way most organizations, I think and operate. I wanted to ask you a question. We spoke a bit earlier about, I mentioned some of the open domains that we're exploring across finance, design, manufacture, education, and whether from where you are, you're seeing particular opportunities for cross-disciplinary collaboration in open, or where it's been most fertile, and where you think perhaps it hasn't gone yet, but it could.
Well, as I said earlier, I think these things have started out in software and digital, and are now, you know, leaking out in an interesting way into the world of product, and the whole maker movement, and the whole kind of 3D printing, and all the potential of that is huge and fascinating. The whole kind of rise and shift towards kind of open government, I think, has, you know, massive ramifications that we haven't even begun to think about. So I think we've been doing some work recently in some sectors that have incredibly long investment cycles. So in transport and in pharmaceuticals and in defense and some of those industries, where the product development life cycles are measured in decades, if not, you know, 20, 30 years in some cases, for, you know, infrastructure to be spent. I think when it comes to open innovation and collaboration, when you have 2 or more parties working together to sustain the momentum of a relationship and collaboration over those sorts of time periods, over decades, is incredibly difficult. So I think one of the challenges is around is just kind of sustaining momentum and interest over a long time period. So I think kind of product-based businesses are playing catch-up, and those that have kind of long cycles. But, you know, the opportunity of an open approach is to cut cycle times massively and to do stuff better, cheaper, faster. But that's not a given. But I think those sorts of industries will take longer to adopt some of these behaviours.
And that's an interesting kind of point to segue into about this idea of infrastructure and thinking of the role of institutes traditionally as these kinds of holders of knowledge, a place where people converge and share practice and experience, a place where new research is commissioned, where protocols are set, and even ethics are set within industries. With this kind of set of roles in mind, how you could see an open institute supporting, what kind of infrastructures would be supporting open business in new ways? Well,
so, I mean, something that we do in a microcosm, and I could see an open institute doing at a national or global kind of scale, is just providing those kind of lateral cross-cutting connections. So at the moment, rightly or wrongly, we tend to be well networked within our own sectors or our own geographies or our own domains of expertise, whatever they may be. But I think I think fundamentally the solution to almost any problem that we have is out there already. So it's not a problem. I think innovation in the 21st century isn't around creating or inventing new solutions. It's about being a good detective, finding the solutions wherever they may be, or building those kind of networks and relationships kind of across the piece. So whether it's a solution to a problem that's arisen in the rail industry coming from the software industry, or a health kind of challenge coming from local authorities or wherever it could be. So I think an institute could cement some of that cross-cutting connections and networks in a really, really interesting way. IDEO have this metaphor of the T-shaped individual. They like to hire T-shaped people that have a depth of expertise, but a breadth of, I guess, social skills, so they can talk to the creatives, but they can also talk to the accountants. Lego have taken that metaphor to talk about becoming a T-shaped organization, so they have a depth of kind of toy manufacturing expertise, but they interface very broadly. And I think we're still in the thralls of defining ourselves by our knowledge and our expertise, and I think an open institute could provide that sort of the cross of the T, if you will, across industries, across sectors, across institutions, and I think that would be very interesting and very valuable. And often, because those networks are invisible, they're hard to pin down and appreciate firsthand. But I think an institute could play a valuable role in that.
I'm interested in this cross-cutting, this idea of being a cross-cutting or T-shaped organization, and the role that the institution could play in that capacity. You mentioned some of the tools and some of the things that are important for making this happen, and just some of the tools that you use. You were mentioning earlier, but also the importance of face-to-face interaction. So I wanted to tap into a question around where you think there currently are gaps in terms of resources that are missing on a day-to-day basis for people. I mean, we're seeing the emergence of all these co-working spaces, and that is cheap space that obviously that's not quite enough. So what kind of tools could you envision being helpful for doing this kind of cross-cutting thing?
So three things spring to mind. One is co-working spaces, but with a difference. Two is around sort of intellectual property kind of regimes, and three is around, I guess, a marketplace of buyers and sellers. So just quickly, in turn, we started out our life as a business 3.5 years ago, taking out membership of the Hub and various other co-working spaces, and that's fantastic, and we loved that. But we quite quickly outgrew that as a business. And to some extent, we're now in a relatively traditional kind of our own kind of studio space, which we love and it's our home. But we miss the kind of the buzziness and the busyness of the co-working spaces, which have now cropped up all over the world, really. So I think as businesses become more agile and more networked, and I think there's a gap in the market for kind of growing businesses, the 10-person, the 50-person, the 500-person organization, where you still want the interaction and the buzz and of of the co-working spaces, but it also scales, I guess, with the organisations, and so I would love to see, and I don't think this really exists yet, certainly in London that I'm aware of, and I'm not really aware of anywhere in the world, that kind of mixes up the big companies, the small companies, the charities, the social entrepreneurs, and mixes it all up together in one space. I think that's where London in particular plays a really interesting role, because it's all here in one city, whereas that's not the case elsewhere. So I think there's an interesting kind of spatial play, and I'd love to put my name down as a tenant if that's what you're going to be doing in the short term, in the longer term. Second thing is around kind of IP and business models. Creative Commons is a wonderful thing. It's a great initiative. It only currently works for copyright. Can we extend that to patents and products and other aspects of intellectual property? Much more easy ways to share flexibly ideas, assets. I think often a lot of digital businesses don't even bother with protecting their ideas, because being first to market is all that really matters. But I think as we want to scale some of these things, then without wishing to sound too protectionist, but having some kind of protection and policies around that are helpful. I don't quite know what the solutions to that are and look like, but I think there's quite a lot of work to be done in that space, and there's people like Lawrence Lessig and others kind of pioneering kind of thinking in this space. And then the third thing around kind of buyers and sellers, I think in the last decade or so, I've seen a lot of aggregation of, especially in the innovation space, of, I guess, the supply side, so the startups or the universities that have technology or solutions or ideas that they are selling, and of course there are thousands and millions of these people, so some aggregation is helpful. I think where we haven't had aggregation is from the buyer side, which might be the big companies, it might be governments, it might be big social organisations, not-for-profits. Those organisations still tend to operate as a bit of an island, so the P&Gs and the Legos of this world push out their needs in different ways, in different formats. If an institute or a marketplace could aggregate all of that as a resource for UK PLC or even for the world, that's a very valuable thing. So a needs network of innovation opportunities or something from any sector, from any, and that's easily taggable, searchable, and all the rest of it. I think that is very valuable. And then Open Institute, whoever, 100% Open, is a bit of a broker and a facilitator of the buyers and sellers in that space. And it's not always a case that the buyers are the big guys and the sellers are the small guys. Those roles can be reversed as well. But I think I would like to see some kind of needs marketplace that could galvanise and underpin such an institution.
Great. I'm just wondering if there's any last thoughts you have on what your key emphasis would be in terms of an investment, making a kind of wise investment.
A wise investment in what or who?
In the sense of investing in an infrastructure for the OI, just rapid fire ideas on how to make sure that it's this kind of idea of future proofing and.
Sure. Well, my immediate thought is it's easy to invest in physical stuff, in buildings, and to a lesser degree people that we can point to, this is where our money went. But I think it's much harder to invest in the networks and the ecosystems and the work involved in making some of that stuff happen. So I would say, I don't quite know what the best way to do this is, but happy to think about it with you another time, is investing in those networks. And part of that, demonstrating the value of that, is to visualize those networks, to make those connections, to make it real. And whether that's around events or physical places or other ways of doing that. So I think networks and networking is still, as a former boss of mine used to say, networking is only one letter away from not working, in a slightly sort of jokey fashion, of course, fully realizing the value of networking. But I think people are often reluctant to invest in networks and networking, but I think that's where the real value lies of an institution. So if there's ways in which the institution could do that and visualize that in interesting, creative ways that makes it easier to work your way around and find the right people and find the right organizations, I think that would be a worthwhile thing, as well as, the more classic investment in buildings and transport infrastructure and people and all the rest of it. So,
Thank you.
thank you.